Bobby, fascinating discussion John Micklethwaite had with Petraeus yesterday, and I think there was a lot of conversation about not just what's happening with the war, but what happens afterwards, and that is a big question mark, isn't it?
That is very much a very big question mark. Now, I lived in Baghdad. I was in Baghdad when Petraeus was implementing the policy that he was discussing yesterday, and I think the point he was making is that it's not enough just to go and bomb a neighborhood and then push people to the next neighborhood, then bomb that neighborhood, and so on, which is essentially what we've seen Israel do. The key is to make sure that the neighborhood that you've cleared cannot then be reoccupied by Hamas. And to do that, you have to be able to hold that neighborhood. You also have to make sure that the people, that the civilians, you make a distinction between the civilians and Hamas. You make sure the civilians are protected from Hamas as well as from yourself. You make sure they get medical attention and the aid. Basically, everything that the Israelis have not been doing is what Petraeus says they ought to be doing. We've also seen, and it's not just on our stage here, we're hearing the same things from within the Israeli war cabinet. The defense minister, Yoav Gallant, came out overnight and completely disagreed with his prime minister, with Bibi Netanyahu's strategy. So there are big cracks within the Israeli consensus.
And I think people are underestimating that division within the war cabinet and within the Israeli cabinet as well, because so far the interpretation was that it was the war cabinet who's pushing the Prime Minister Netanyahu in a more hawkish direction. But now you are beginning to hear the likes of defense ministers saying we need to have a post-war plan. So that it is a break. We need to have a post-war plan and another important division, whereas Netanyahu wants the other Arab states to come and provide peacekeeping for the post-war period. His own defense minister saying, no, that won't work. We have to take responsibility. Israel has to take responsibility. Again, we heard from Petraeus here yesterday saying no Arab state is going to want to go in there and clean up Israel's mess, not while Hamas still remains. Yeah, and that echoes some of the conversations I've had. Another major geopolitical story I just want to bring you. So Russian President Putin is now in China, his first trip abroad since the elections. We're getting a few headlines coming through. President Xi is telling Putin that China is willing to be Russia's good friend. So that is being quoted on CCTV, national TV. Xi also adds to safeguard world fairness and justice with Russia. So reiterating the close relationship between the two. I mean, how should the rest of the world read this? Russia is engaged in a war in Ukraine. We talk about NATO, Western Alliance, talking about the need for extra weapons, beefing up the artillery and support coming from the West in this war. And yet China, on the other side, other economic superpower, are reiterating their alliance with Russia.
Yeah, and this was what we expected. This is music to Putin's ears, of course. But it's China just reminding the world that they have picked a side, and it is the Russian side. Xi Jinping was just in Europe. He made this long trip through Europe trying to tell the Europeans that China are your friends. But here he's on the other side showing the Europeans that he's not really their friend because he's supporting, openly embracing somebody who is actively working to destabilize Europe, not just damage Ukraine, but destabilize Europe as a whole. So the contradictions in the Chinese position are very clear. Xi Jinping doesn't care about that. This is a photo op for a domestic audience, and Putin is very happy because this is exactly what he wants to hear.
And also, he's very happy because China buys their oil. And so my question is, what is China's impetus here? Is it political or is it economic? Because they just want to buy cheap oil. They need it.
It's more than one thing. They're asserting their dominance over Russia. This is a historical opportunity for China to basically have Russia where it wants Russia to be. It is China's way of saying to the world that we take a very different view. We don't necessarily go along with the Western consensus. And remember that there is a Cold War between the U.S. and China. We've heard that in these halls several times over the last 2 days. And China, in this Cold War, is charting out its own position. And by siding with Russia, it is reminding the world that we have a very different view.
Are we likely to get a meaningful response out of China to these new tariffs that are being imposed, do you think?
It's very interesting. These tariffs were coming. Everybody knew they were coming. Perhaps not so strong, but we knew they were coming. So the Chinese could have had their response in terms of export restrictions or their tariffs locked and ready to go as soon as Biden announced they would announce. They didn't. Instead, all they did was send out a strongly worded statement. And that's really quite interesting, because the Chinese position is not as strong as it used to be. Xi Jinping has to deal with a troubled domestic economy. The real estate crisis is real and getting worse. He can't afford at this moment to ratchet up the tensions beyond a certain point. There will be a retaliation. There'll be some. There can't not be. But it's very interesting that it hasn't happened immediately. And I would be very surprised if the retaliation was very, very strong. I think we'll hear more rhetoric than actual action.